topics and opinions expressed in the following show are solely those of the host and their guests and not those of W4CY Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4CY Radio or its employees or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4CY Radio.
What's working on purpose anyway? Each week, we ponder the answer to this question. People ache for meaning and purpose at work, to contribute their talents passionately and know their lives really matter. They crave being part of an organization that inspires them and helps them grow into realizing their highest potential. Business can be such a force for good in the world, elevating humanity. In our program, we provide guidance and inspiration to help usher in this world we all want, working on purpose. Now, here's your host, Dr. Elise Cortez.
Welcome back to the Working on Purpose program, which has been brought to you with passion and pride since February of 2015. Thanks for tuning in this week. Great to have you. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. If we've not met before and you don't know me, I'm a workforce advisor, organizational psychologist, management consultant, logotherapist, speaker, and author. My team and I at Gusto Now help companies enliven and fortify their operations by building a dynamic, high-performance culture, inspirational leadership, and nurturing managers activated by meaning and purpose. Many organizations are not aware of how critical it is to invest in developing their leaders and managers, not just for their own effectiveness, but also to avoid burnout and keep them fulfilled, and also that they can also measure and monitor the purpose experience in their organization to keep it working as an operational imperative. And did you know that inspired employees in purpose-led companies outperform their satisfied peers by a factor of 2.25 to 1? In other words, inspiration and purpose are good for the bottom line. You can learn more about us and how we can work together at gusto-now.com or my personal site, elisecortez.com. Getting in today's program, we have with us today Elizabeth Weingarten. She is a journalist and applied behavioral scientist who works at the intersection of science and storytelling. She's the author of the new book, How to Fall in Love with Questions, a new way to thrive in times of uncertainty, which we'll be talking about today. She joins us from San Francisco. Elizabeth, a hearty welcome to Working on Purpose.
Thank you so much for having me, Elise. I'm so excited to be here.
You're so welcome. I'm so glad that you were findable on LinkedIn when I reached out to you. As we were talking before we got on air, you and I were engaging over a post about Jeff Wetzler, who I'd had on my program earlier, talking about his book relative to seeking inquiry and feedback from others. And when I saw your profile and the book that you've written, I was like, you gotta come on. And you said yes.
You know, I love that we were able to connect on LinkedIn. And I also love that there's this growing community of people who are so passionate about questions and curiosity as tools to help us all live more meaningful lives and filled with purpose.
I agree. And let's just show our viewers who are tuning in. Look at this beautiful thing you put into the world. Isn't it gorgeous?
Thank you. I appreciate that. We went back and forth on the cover quite a bit, but I like where we ended up.
I understand. The cover is one of the hardest choices. Forget the whole book. Just it's the cover.
Totally.
And by the way, let me just say something, obvious here. Your subtitle is about uncertainty. What uncertainty are you talking about? We could possibly be talking about today's times.
Oh, we live in the most predictable certain worlds ever. I don't think anybody, no, it's so funny. I didn't, when I started writing this book, I could never have anticipated how much uncertainty would grow to the extent that it, has been and was when this book came out this past spring. But, I very much wanted this book to be a guide for people who are finding themselves feeling stuck in uncertainty. And we can talk about that a little bit more, but the definition that I begin the book with is kind of like, what is uncertainty, right? We talk about uncertainty all the time, but uncertainty, as I bring in this definition from a couple of psychologists, is a sense of doubt that stops or delays progress. In action. So it's really that feeling of, I don't have the answers. I don't know what's going on. And I feel like I can't move forward. And so the question is, how do we actually move forward when we don't have all the answers in our lives?
Yeah. I thought it was really beautiful how you talked about that. And I want to get to more of, well, let me just situate a couple of things or one thing in particular that I got out of that particular aspect of it is that you said that research suggests that we tend to exploit options that are familiar to us rather than exploring new choices, even though the best choice is generally to alternate between exploiting what's familiar and exploring what's new. I think that's key, that you are situating throughout your book this notion that we tend to hearken back to what's familiar or already known about us. I think that's a really important thing that we need to ferret out for this conversation.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that in times of uncertainty, there's this tendency to be afraid of the unknown, right? And we can talk about this a little bit more, but we're wired as humans to want to avoid uncertainty and seek certainty, seek the known at any cost. And part of that is how we evolved, evolutionarily speaking. It takes more energy for us to deal with uncertainty. And when food was scarce, we were evolving to try to make do with less energy intensive activities, less food, right? So we're really trying still in our modern age to try to avoid any activities that make us spend more energy than we need to. So we're trying to seek what's known and seek what's certain. But when we do that, we end up cutting ourselves off from possibilities, from different kind of ways of being in the world that could end up, leading us to really kind of exciting futures. But it's understandable. We kind of have this desire to cling to the known and to the certain, and we end up making a lot of fear-based decisions based on that versus decisions based on curiosity and that desire to explore.
Yes, for sure. One of the things I always find fascinating is where these ideas come from. Over the 10 and a half years I've been hosting this podcast, I've talked to so many authors in that time, right? And so a book comes from somewhere. And of course, I read your book, so I know where yours came from. But our listeners and viewers who haven't yet maybe picked it up don't. So let's, in this early part of our conversation, talk about how this book came to be and what you were going through to try to learn and grapple with what you were dealing with at the time that helped you get acquainted with this notion of relating to uncertainty the way that you do now.
Yeah, absolutely. So this book really emerged during a time in my life when I was buckling under really heavy questions. And this was actually during the pandemic. And so I'm sure nobody else was dealing with uncertainty at that time, right? This was a time when everybody was probably asking some big questions. For me, the questions were about my marriage and about my career. And so I'll give you all a little bit of context. I had been in a relationship for several years at that point, but we had recently gotten married. We were a few months in to the marriage. I had long kind of felt this kind of push and pull in my relationship. I felt pulled to my husband because there were so many ways that he challenged me, that the relationship was kind of helping me become a better person. I loved him, passionately. And at the same time, we were very different people. And so there was a lot of friction in the relationship too. And so I had always kind of felt equal parts love and doubt. And this question of, is this the right person for me? Should we be together? And I was asking this question a few months after we got married, and it was getting louder because of some factors that I talk a little bit about in the book. So I'm holding on to this question of, should we get a divorce? And for anybody that's ever had that question, it's a very scary, heavy question to be dealing with. It can feel very lonely. It can feel very isolating. So that's question number one. Question number two, I had also recently left a job to pursue a creative project that was really meaningful to me. And I was at this point, I had been working on it for many months. And I had just been told by somebody who I was working with on this project that the direction that I had sunk all of this time and energy into was not working. And so I'm at this crossroads in my relationship. I'm at this crossroads in my career where all of a sudden this thing that I thought was going to be my next big, break, my next big project, that's not working out. And so I'm wondering, what am I doing with my life? And I, at that point, was feeling kind of rather desperate to find some answers to these questions. And the advice that I kept finding again and again in self-help and pop psychology books was just to kind of, quote, embrace uncertainty.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if you've heard that advice before, but perhaps that will sound familiar. It's everywhere. And to me, when I read things telling me to embrace uncertainty, it felt so unhelpful, because I think sometimes in life, sure, we want to embrace uncertainty, right? Maybe your family is planning a surprise for your birthday. Great. That's fun uncertainty. I'm happy to embrace that. But for me, the uncertainty in my life felt so painful and so scary, that it wasn't something that I wanted to embrace. And it almost felt like this form of kind of toxic positivity. So, it was around that time that luckily I discovered a much older book that for me contained what was much better, if not more challenging advice. And that book was Letters to a Young Poet. And for those who aren't familiar with this book, it's a book of correspondence between the Austrian poet Rainer Maria Rilke and a 19-year-old aspiring poet by the name of Franz Capus. And it's from the early 20th century. And it's a book that counts people like Lady Gaga, Dustin Hoffman, Marilyn Monroe among its fans. And I learned in writing this book, actually, that Lady Gaga even has a line from it tattooed on her. So it has quite an interesting kind of modern history, too. So the whole book is beautiful, but I was really struck by one part of it in particular. And that's a part where Capus is asking Rilke for all kinds of advice, not only about how to become a poet, but also how to live his life. And, of course, if you know a 19-year-old, you know that they're full of questions, right? But at the end of the day, Franz Capus could be any of us. We're all asking questions at any point of our life. But what makes this book so remarkable is that Rilke famously responds not with an answer to Capus per se, but by telling him how important it is to, quote, love the questions themselves, as if they were locked rooms or books written in a foreign language. And he advises Capus to not search for the answers now, and talks about the importance of living the questions. But of course, Rilke never explained what he meant by living the questions now, or how to think about loving the questions. And he also wasn't thinking about really how to do this in a time of AI and Google and smartphones and social media influencers. So the book is really an exploration of, how do we fall in love with the questions of our lives, particularly the ones that can be really painful, and especially in a culture in which so many of us have become addicted to fast, easy answers.
Okay, so I get delighted when my authors that come on my podcast do something like you did in your book, or you've taken what you did, that piece of work, and you strewn it through your whole entire book, so that every chapter really starts with a snippet from some of that correspondence. It's delicious, Elizabeth. It's just delicious. So I really like how you brought us in, and then how you used that text to teach from, to illuminate with, and some of the prose is just delightful. So I just want to say that. While we're on this subject, you did mention that the bit about smartphones, and I was really captivated with what you wrote in the book, that you referenced someone named Carlton, who I think might be a researcher, and how they became very curious about the widespread smartphone use and how it might be influencing our collective capacity to tolerate uncertainty. And he doesn't draw a direct correlation, but it's quite an interesting idea. If, in fact, this idea that we can always look at our phone really quick and look anything up, it wouldn't be surprising to me that would actually contribute to our inability, or our unwillingness to want to embrace uncertainty. Can you say a bit more?
Absolutely. So if we think about our tolerance for uncertainty as a muscle, right? You can think about, if you're going to the gym once a month or once a year, you're not going to think of yourself as somebody that is, really strengthening your muscles and really fit. Versus if you're somebody that is maybe doing some kind of strength training or exercise multiple times a week. And so the same goes with really figuring out how to increase that tolerance for uncertainty. Tolerance for uncertainty, as I mentioned earlier, is not something that comes naturally to us as humans. It's difficult. And so the idea is, how do we build up that strength and that tolerance? And so the point that Nicholas Carlton, who is a psychology professor at the University of Regina in Canada, his research is really interesting because it suggests that we're losing all of these opportunities to strengthen that uncertainty tolerance muscle every time we do little things during the day. So for instance, you're about to go to a new restaurant. If you're like me, you immediately Google the menu, right? And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. It's fun to check it out. But the point is that there are lots of little opportunities to kind of sit with the discomfort of uncertainty and kind of be with whatever emotions you're feeling in that moment. And so whether it's, you know what, I'm just going to wait and see what the menu is when I get there, or I'm traveling to a new city, I'm not going to map out everything I'm doing every day. I'm going to wander around and see what I find. And maybe maybe every day isn't this kind of optimized version of travel, but that's okay. That's kind of, I'm leaning into that uncertainty and the unpredictability of life. So I think his point, is I found it really interesting, and kind of trying to think about how do I build some of those moments into my day-to-day life so that when I'm dealing with these bigger life uncertainties, I have a foundation from which to kind of draw more strength to deal with some of that kind of bigger picture uncertainty.
I love that. Let's build our uncertainty muscles, shall we? On that note, let's grab our first break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We're on the air with Elizabeth Weingarten, who is a journalist and applied behavioral scientist who works at the intersection of science and storytelling. We've been talking about where this book came from. Why is navigating uncertainty so powerful and opportunistic for us? After the break, we're going to do a quick dive into what does a life of loving questions look like, and talk about the 4 ways that Elizabeth encourages us to embrace questions, 4 different kinds of questions. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us, and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, as I am dedicated to helping create a world where organizations thrive because their people thrive, are led by inspirational leaders that help them find and contribute their greatness, and we do business that betters the world. I keep researching and writing my own books. So one of my latest came out. It's called The Great Revitalization: How Activating Meaning and Purpose Can Radically Enliven Your Business. And I wrote it to help leaders understand today's discerning and diverse workforce. What do they want and need to give their best and want to stay? And then I give you 22 best practices to equip you to provide that into your culture so they will. You can find my books on Amazon or my website, elisecortez.com. If you are just joining us, my guest is Elizabeth Weingarten, the author of How to Fall in Love with Questions, a new way to thrive in times of uncertainty. So before we dive back into what we were talking about, I want to share with you briefly, because I think you'll appreciate that given what you shared just before we went on break. I had a gentleman on named David Pearl on my podcast some time ago, and he runs an organization called Street Wisdom. And essentially, he's in the UK, but they do these things all over the world. They do walk shops where people literally might have a question on their mind, and then they're sort of ushered into this mental space of being able to enjoy and fall into the moment. And then they are released into the city, and they do a kind of they walk through a city, and they might just notice what the city is telling them as they walk through. And sometimes they get some new insights or a new way of looking at things, et cetera. It's really quite delightful. So just wanted to share that because I thought you might really jam on that idea.
I love that. I mean, I think, and we can get to this in a little bit, but one of the reasons I love this practice of developing a greater awareness of the question that you're asking in your life, and I talk in the book about developing a questions practice, is because I think questions can act as really powerful filters for the world, right? When you become aware of a question that you're asking, to your point, Elise, it really helps to filter in what are some of the possible kind of answers and insights that you may not have been aware of without kind of bringing that awareness first to the big question that you're asking.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, now it's a good time for us to talk about those 4 different kinds of questions, or ways that you help us relate to questions like parts of a fruit tree. That's just so creative. So let's talk about the 4 different kinds of questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So when I first started writing the book and I would talk to people about it, they'd be like, okay, so what type of questions are we talking about, right? Like, are we talking about what's for dinner? How can I be happy? So of course, there are lots of different types of questions in the world. And when we talk about developing a different relationship to our questions so that we can then have a different relationship to uncertainty, it helps to really know what type of question are we asking. And when I go through this framework, I think keep in mind, if you're somebody that's asking a question right now, knowing what type of question you're asking can help you understand your expectations for that question. Mm-hmm. And what I mean by that is, how much should you be waiting around for an answer to that question? Is it time to let that question go? So let me kind of start with the first part of this 4-part fruit tree. So the first type of question is a peach question. And like a peach, these are the types of questions that ripen rather quickly into an answer, right? So it's a question like, will I get the job? You're going to know pretty quickly the answer to that question. So that's your peach style question. The second style question is a pawpaw style question. And so pawpaw fruit, I learned while reporting this book, it takes the pawpaw tree sometimes 5 to 7 years to actually grow the pawpaw fruit. So these are questions that are a little bit longer term, but they're questions that you're still ultimately going to get the answer to. So maybe it's a question like, am I going to find fulfillment and satisfaction in this career change that I'm making? So the third type of question is the heartwood question. And heartwood is the part of the tree that actually stays with the tree for its entire life. It's the core of the tree. The bark grows around the heartwood in circles. And so you can think about your heartwood questions as the questions that they stay with you over the course of your life. They evolve as you evolve. And so these are the questions like, who am I? Who am I becoming? How do I live a life of meaning and purpose? These are the questions that aren't ever answerable in a permanent way, right? Maybe you have an answer at one time in your life, but at a different time, you reopen the question and you explore it anew. The fourth type of question is a dead leaf. And this is the type of question that maybe at one point it served a purpose. It no longer serves a purpose in your life. It is a question to let go of. And these are the questions in our lives that are really kind of keeping us stuck in patterns of rumination and regret. Mm-hmm. Questions about, why didn't I break up with this person? What if I had just taken that other career path? The kind of what ifs, should have, all of that language that is, fundamentally not moving you forward into a new place. It's keeping you stuck in the past in a place where you're not growing. So those are, that's kind of the gist of the types of questions. And I think as you kind of move into a questions practice and kind of becoming a little bit more aware of your questions, it can really help to have that deeper understanding of kind of what type of question am I asking and what can I expect from that question.
I think it's very powerful. Just having even just that ability to segment questions like that. And then also to your point, recognizing, I know for me, I've gone through periods in my life when I spent way too much time in the dead leaves variety, way too much time, right?
I think you're similar to so many people, right? I think there are often so many kind of dead leaves rustling around, in there. But I'm curious to hear, do you have a pawpaw or a heartwood question that's been on your mind in this moment?
Well, I would say the heartwood question for me is always unfolding. So I am a person who I have stepped onto the path of purpose, right? I mean, this has been a chosen intentional path, and it hasn't necessarily been an easy path. It's not necessarily convenient to live your purpose per se. You have to be obedient to it if you're going to really answer it. And there's a lot of other ways to live life, I would say, in an easier fashion than to really pursue and give yourself over to purpose. So I would say that I do question, how is this going to unfold for me? It has continued to unfold. And I never would have imagined, Elizabeth, some 10 years ago, that I would have 5 books out and that we would have stood up the Gusto Now Academy, which has 9 different learning communities to it. I never would have imagined we would have done that. And yet I know there is so much more beyond this, but I don't know what it is. And I'm okay with that. I'm okay with the uncertainty. But it's a sort of like giving myself over to that open space that is part of my dance with life, what I'm learning as well.
Mm-hmm. It reminds me, one of the stories that I tell in the book is about the educator and activist Parker Palmer,
Yes.
who very much, he's written many best-selling, beautiful books. One is called Let Your Life Speak. And it's, at the core, so much of what he writes and talks about is, staying true to what, he describes in his work, the things that you can't not do.
Yes,
right?
yes.
And I think I hear that in what you're saying, just kind of, acknowledging, hey, there's this other path over here that would probably be a lot easier for me, but then there's this other work and I can't not do it. And he jokes, he knows it's a double negative, but it's the truest way for him to say it, right?
I use that exact phrase all the time. What can you not do?
Yeah.
And so that's really powerful. So thank you for indulging me into this, because this is a big reason why I keep doing this podcast, Elizabeth, is because it is a catalyzing agent for me, because I read my guest books cover to cover every week. And then we write a newsletter article the following week about it to apply the concepts. I mean, this stuff works in me and I seek it. This is not something that, I don't audit this experience. So thank you for letting me also, swim in the questions too. And speaking of Parker Palmer, and I do have a couple of his books, you do reference him and Rockwell and Giamatti, but I want to situate for our listeners and viewers, what does a life of loving questions look like, or what might it look like for people? Give them a bit of a promise of what that could be.
Yeah, absolutely. So I should say the whole kind of second part of the book is really devoted to exploring through both science and story what this can look like. It was really important to me to not just kind of provide, here's the 5 steps to doing this, right? But to really look at the lives of real people who have really tried to organize their kind of thinking and their actions and behavior around this idea of loving the questions. And I think one way to think about this, and something that I observed in really almost everybody that I talked to, is that a life spent kind of loving and living your questions is a life when you are kind of continuously being led back to yourself and your relationship with yourself. And something that I found in the book is that our relationship to uncertainty is actually really just a reflection of our relationship to ourselves. And so people who are kind of spending their lives really kind of focused on this deeper exploration of questions, bringing deeper awareness to the questions in their lives. And again, we can talk about this maybe later. I have a whole kind of approach, what I talk about as a questions practice, and kind of a guided way of getting into that yourself. But what you find from people that are kind of using questions, they're using them as kind of an internal GPS or an internal compass. Kind of leading them back to, what do I really want? Who do I really want to be? And you can see this in Parker Palmer's story. He was somebody who grew up kind of as the golden boy, as he describes it. People kind of had a lot of expectations for him, who he should be, what success looked like for him. And as he kind of went further and further in his academics and his career, he started to feel like those expectations were sitting heavy on his shoulders, and that they just weren't right for him, that he was feeling called to go on a very different path, a path that he kind of often describes as going into the woods. And ended up, instead of going down this path of being an academic at a prestigious academic institution, he ends up first, becoming taking some time at a Quaker organization, kind of learning all of the traditions of this like Quaker community, spending many years there in this kind of educational community, and ultimately becoming a writer, an educator, an activist who has moved and inspired, millions of people around the world. And but he writes about how, and he talked to me about how difficult this was at many stages of his life, but that ultimately it was these big questions that were foundational to him continuously finding his way back to himself, what he wanted apart from the shoulds, right? Who we should be, what we should want to do. And this relates to, I think, a really key part of having a questions practice, which is asking yourself, am I asking the right questions in my life? And we can perhaps talk about that a little bit more, but I'd say that's really one of the central parts of living a life and being inspired by your questions.
And one more thing to situate that into my world, because really so much of what I've cared about in my practice as an organizational psychologist and working in organizations with leadership and development is it is growing people into their higher potential. And so one of the things that we've sort of been talking about through this conversation already, but I want to hit this specifically. You have a couple lines in your book that if you could speak to them, that I think are just really, really alluring and can help our listeners and viewers maybe change their relationship to how they're viewing uncertainty. And the lines are, as uncertainty amplifies who we are, it can also reveal parts of us that before we've been able to ignore or suppress or deny. At least for me, that's you. A big part of what's uncomfortable about living with uncertainty results from resisting this revolution and clinging to an old identity or way of being. I think that's really powerful. And when we help our listeners and viewers recognize that when we don't allow ourselves to relate to uncertainty in a more open fashion, that we are resisting our own growth. And I think that's really powerful.
That's exactly right. You hit it on the head. The fundamentally, loving your questions is about embracing your own growth, and embracing the fact that it can be really hard and scary. The path to growth is not an easy one, but ultimately it can be one of the most fulfilling and rewarding ones. And I think about this when I think also about kind of going back to Rilke, this poet, who inspired the book largely. Rilke has a very nuanced take on love. And he writes about love as the most difficult task that we undertake in our lives, and yet the most rewarding one, right? So it's far from this kind of toxic positivity of embrace uncertainty. Loving the questions really acknowledges that, when we're in relationship with these questions of our lives, some days we're going to love that experience and want to give it a hug. And other days we're going to, really feel frustrated and fed up with it, just the way you would with any relationship that you have, right? Anybody that has a long-term partner or friend or anybody that you've been connected with for a long time, there are days when you feel so connected to that person and days when you have no idea who that person is. Right. And so I think the same thing goes on this path to kind of growth and self-discovery, days when it feels really right and days when it's really, really difficult. And that's all part of it. And, I think that is ultimately I think you're absolutely right when you talk about kind of the way that questions are that key to our growth and development. And if I have time, I can share a story actually that illustrates that really nicely.
Well, let's do that really quickly after the break. So hang on to it and let's grab our last break. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. We're on the air with Elizabeth Weingarten, who is a journalist and applied behavioral scientist who works at the intersection of science and storytelling. We've been talking about the benefits of embracing uncertainty in our lives and questions in our lives. After the break, we're going to talk about the opportunity to seek the right sources to ask about our questions and also embracing patience. We'll be right back.
Dr. Elise Cortez is a management consultant specializing in meaning and purpose, an inspirational speaker and author. She helps companies visioneer for greater purpose among stakeholders and develop purpose-inspired leadership and meaning-infused cultures that elevate fulfillment, performance, and commitment within the workforce. To learn more or to invite Elise to speak to your organization, please visit her at elisecortez.com. Let's talk about how to get your employees working on purpose. This is Working on Purpose with Dr. Elise Cortez. To reach our program today or to open a conversation with Elise, send an email to Elise, A-L-I-S-E, at elisecortez.com. Now, back to Working on Purpose.
Thanks for staying with us and welcome back to Working on Purpose. I'm your host, Dr. Elise Cortez. As you know by now, my program is dedicated to helping and to empower and inspiring you along your journey to realize more of your potential. If you want to learn more about how we can work together and learn about the Gusto Now Academy for leaders and individuals on various journeys alike, make your way to gusto-now.com and then navigate to the training tab and you'll find the Academy there. If you are just now joining us, my guest is Elizabeth Weingarten, the author of How to Fall in Love with Questions, a new way to thrive in times of uncertainty. So before the break, you mentioned this wonderful 5-letter word. Did someone say story?
Yes. So we were talking about loving the questions as and the promise of loving the questions as being helping you on that path of growth and self-discovery, even when it feels really difficult. And I really was so inspired by so many of the stories that I tell in the book, but one of them in particular, I tell the story of a woman named Barbara Schoen. And Barbara is somebody who, as she was growing up, she was in a kind of more of a working class household, and she describes not having, many educational opportunities. She ended up getting really lucky in that when she was graduating high school, she got a job at a firm that offered to pay for her college. So she gets to go to college and she works so hard at this job and in college. And she starts to just kind of see her own kind of success. She's moving up the career ladder. She's excited. She's getting all these opportunities. She becomes this consultant. She's getting to travel around the world. She's also super active. She loves cycling. She's living this life that when she was growing up, she never could have imagined. And in the back of her head, she keeps thinking about the fact that, what? I got all these opportunities I never expected. I want to give back at some point. But that voice was kind of a quiet one. She just knew, what, I want to keep moving up the ladder. This is exciting. And I'll get to that at some point. I'll get to that giving back idea. And so Barbara, when she's in her early 30s, she is heading back from a funeral with her siblings, and they're in Michigan. And they're on the road. It's a snowy day, and she gets into a car accident. Unfortunately, she ends up being paralyzed. And she, in the aftermath of this accident, she talks about how, of course, she's struggling with so many different questions, right? So much uncertainty. It's kind of hard, mind-boggling, frankly, to imagine all the uncertainty that kind of can come out of that experience. But something that she said struck me, and I think about it, frankly, all the time, which is that amidst all of this uncertainty and all of this kind of fear that she had about the future, she also felt this sense of relief. And she talks about the fact that inside of this uncertainty, she felt a sense of freedom. And that's because in her old life, she felt like she didn't have a choice. She had this one identity that she was building. She had this one path forward she had to take. She had to keep climbing up that ladder. And all of a sudden, she had this opportunity in this, uncertainty and this transformation to stretch into a new identity, to change who she was, and to become more of the person who, that voice in the back of her head wanted to be, that person who was maybe giving back and who was trying to help other people find those opportunities. And so it really, it's I think such an important reminder, right? That, sometimes we have these experiences, these uncertain experiences that can feel really scary, that can feel like they're narrowing us and our possibilities in life, when in fact, we can also see them as a way of gaining new freedom and new opportunity to create new identities for ourselves.
That sounds a bit to me like logotherapy. That's Dr. Viktor Frankl's work in existential psychology. That's one of my degrees, and it's really about choosing how we relate to whatever life throws at us. And that's another really big thing that I love about your work is, whatever uncertainty comes at us, when you first started, you were talking about how we tend to be diminished by that. We tend to shrink by that. But yet the opportunity is to, step into it, to grow into it and see what it unfolds or activates in us. And that's much more empowering. That's a place that I want to help people get to.
That's exactly right. And I think a theme that runs throughout the book is, there's so much in the world that we can't control right now. There's so much uncertainty around us. And yet, when it comes to the questions that we're asking, when it comes to our own kind of sense of possibility about the future, we have some control, right? And so the question is, how do we take back some of that control and some of that agency in our own lives?
That's my love language, Elizabeth. That's right there. Okay, well, let's just briefly hit on this because there's just a couple other things I want to make sure I get to as well, because I did promise our listeners and viewers that we would talk about your perspective on the importance of seeking the right sources to ask our questions to, if you could address that.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think we all, one of the stories that I tell in the book is about my own experience with astrology.
Yes.
I'm not sure how many listeners, it falls on a spectrum, right? Between people who are like, yes, I love astrology, and people who, think it's absolutely ridiculous and they don't subscribe to it at all. And I would say that I fell somewhere in the middle, probably closer to this is ridiculous. And yet, what I describe in the book is I was gifted a session with an astrologer for a birthday. And I went to the astrologer and I asked this astrologer a question about my relationship. I asked basically if I should be with my, then boyfriend, now husband. And the astrologer told me after reading our charts that the answer was no, that he was not the right fit for me. And that, there was almost no way that it was going to work out between us. And I tell this story, and then I, talked later to another astrologer who is very, very different than the original astrologer that I spoke to, because I had been I think, when it comes to this question of agency and power, right? I had this story in my head that I went to this astrologer. They told me, this thing that was upsetting, and I was kind of the victim, right? That I had gotten this bad kind of information, and they and kind of fallen into this trap of not taking responsibility for these sources that I'm seeking when it comes to seeking answers, right? So something that I talk about in the book is that it's not wrong to seek answers to our questions, but the problem comes when we are seeking the wrong sources as answers. And in this case, I sought a source, an astrologer, somebody that I didn't really believe or trust, with an answer to a question that was really so important to me. And so in the same way that, if you have a question about your relationship, you're probably not going to ask a friend who's been really unlucky in love. The same goes for these questions that we're asking, these big kind of heartwood questions, right? And so, one of the things that I also talk about is that we're living in this time where so many of us have become addicted to fast, easy answers. And these come in the form of, sometimes social media influencers that kind of act like gurus or experts, right? They have the 5 steps to anybody being happier now, right? Or maybe this comes in the form of AI, right? There are all sorts of ways in which we feel uncomfortable when we're in a time of uncertainty, and we're just desperate for those answers. And I've absolutely been there. But I think the bigger point is, how can we take more responsibility for the sources that we're seeking out when we do feel compelled to find those answers for these big questions in our lives.
And that brings us to the next bit here, where I think it can feel like an eternity for us to try to find the answer to these questions, which is where our friend patience comes in. And you talk about the death and rebirth of patience. If you could briefly address that.
Yeah. So patience is a topic that, maybe some of you are kind of rolling your eyes right now because I have joked with a patience researcher, Sarah Schnicker, that patience has a PR problem. Patience is one of those things that, we'd probably all agree, yes, I could probably stand to be more patient, but do I want to work on my patience? Like, no, that doesn't sound very fun. But what I learned is that Sarah Schnicker, who's a professor at Baylor University in Texas, she is really kind of the foremost expert on the science of patience and understanding how cultivating a greater sense of patience in ourselves is actually key to kind of finding a greater sense of well-being during these times of uncertainty in our lives. And maybe counterintuitively being able to pursue goals that are important to us, even when we feel like we've been kind of knocked off the tracks. So, what I describe in the book, I talk a lot about kind of the science of patience, but also the history of patience, and the fact that, for many years, the idea of being patient has become kind of anomalous to a failure of our modern world, a failure of technology. So if we have to be patient, if we're left kind of waiting for something for longer than a few seconds, that's a bug, not a feature of life. And so I think similarly to this kind of intolerance of certainty, building that muscle, patience is also a muscle that we can build. And in doing that, really find that we're able to exist in these periods of uncertainty and not cling after, these old forms of identity or these fast, easy answers that ultimately may not actually get us to where we want to go, which is that kind of path of growth and self-discovery.
That was incredibly rich. Okay, so we're almost through the show already. It happened so fast. Let's finish by situating the idea of how listeners and viewers can develop a questions practice. I love the 18-point set of questions that you have in the book. I love that. So if you can, and we've only got like about a minute and a half to do that.
So the basic idea that I'll share is a questions practice is just like any other practice you have, a meditation practice or a yoga practice. The idea is to bring regular awareness to the questions that you're asking in your life. And the first step of the practice, and I go into depth in the book on this, is kind of approaching some of those big and sometimes painful questions with more curiosity rather than fear. And so that means asking questions like, is this the right question? And in the book, I talk about how to know if your question is the right question for you. And it means really thinking about if this isn't the right question, what's a better or different question for me to ask? And the point of the questions practice is both to develop that deeper relationship with those big questions in your life, and really to kind of be able to move forward with clarity, and not necessarily, to find that you're going to always find answers, but you're still going to be able to move forward in your life. So it's really about, how do I get unstuck from this period of uncertainty in my life, even if I don't have answers in this moment.
I think it's a stunning idea to develop a questions practice. I just think that's terrific. Okay, so I think by now that this show is listened to by people around the world, and they really care about developing themselves, elevating themselves, their themselves as leaders, their teams, their organizations. What would you like to leave them with?
I think the biggest thing that I can leave them with is the importance of using this kind of questions practice as a tool to not only ask yourself questions, but to turn it on the world too, and to use questions as that kind of tool to connect with yourself, but then to also connect with the people who are around you, who you love. Questions are an interpersonal superpower, right? And so I think it's really thinking about how does the power of questions kind of help me connect more deeply in all of these ways in my life.
Okay, so that is eminently quotable. Questions are an interpersonal superpower. What a way to finish, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for coming on Working in Purpose, for doing the work that you're doing, for giving us the beautiful book that you did, and coming on the program. It's been delightful to get to know you and to learn from you.
I have so enjoyed our conversation. Thank you so much for having me and for all of your wonderful questions.
Most welcome. Listeners and viewers, you are going to want to learn more about Elizabeth Weingarten, the work that she does, and the book that she just wrote called How to Fall in Love with Questions. You can start by visiting her personal site, which is elizabethweingarten.com. Let me spell that for you. Elizabeth, standard spelling, Elizabeth, and Weingarten is Weingarten. So elizabethweingarten.com. Last week, if you missed the live show, you can always catch it via recorded podcast. We were on air with Carolina Lasso talking about her book, The Path to Flourishing, 7 Principles for a Joyful, Fulfilling, and Purposeful Life. She is a passionate firecracker of a woman, and you will love her authenticity and lessons shared. Next week, we'll be on air with Tamara Ryan, former longtime CEO of the Women's Bean Project, talking about her book, Followship, 16 Lessons to Become a Leader Worth Following. I'm completely aligned with her message and excited to share it with you. See you then, and together, let's lean in and learn together how to make workplaces that work for everyone, build our inspirational leadership capacity, and find ways to do business in a way that betters the world. Let's work on purpose.
We hope you've enjoyed this week's program. Be sure to tune into Working on Purpose, featuring your host, Dr. Elise Cortez, each week on W4CY. Together, we'll create a world where business operates conscientiously, leadership inspires impassioned performance, and employees are fulfilled in work that provides the meaning and purpose they crave. See you there. Let's work on purpose.